Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecturette about formalizing tense and aspect. We're going to put them together because they form really the same part of a system, although they do address quite a different range of broader issues. Right now we're going to introduce these formalizations, and we're not really going to step into the broader issues. So we lump them together. Now, the basic concept of formalization, of course, is going to start with the syntax, and we want to understand what does the syntax of a sentence look like with tense and aspect. Well, tense, you already know, it comes out of a projection, TP or IP. We're going to use TP, and it comes out of projection that takes the VP as its complement, and we've put the subject inside the VP. But if you notice, we've also added this aspect projection, and the reason is because we need the projection. For one thing, syntactically, a large number of constructions require it, even in English. Semantically, what we need is an aspect. Well, semantically, we distinguish tense from aspect. And if tense has its own projection, then it stands to reason that aspect has its own projection too. We've seen that we want to add meanings as much as we can through the use of projections and heads and things that have syntactic reality. So we add the aspect head. Now in English we put it below tense and above the VP, and we'll see that that might be a universal, in fact, and it would be universal because of the nature of aspect and the nature of tense. So in a lot of languages and a lot of contexts, tense and aspect marking get fused together. Right? So in this French sentence, je traversais la rue, that's what's called the imparfait, or the imperfect, as you'd call it in French language study. Now, this is often called a tense, but it is actually a mix of tense and aspect. Past tense, imperfective aspect. And so it doesn't mean the same thing at all. So we have tense and aspect. In that case, they're put together. But in other cases, they're taken apart. Now, in English, we get a sentence like, we will be going, and that has the future from the modal will, and the be, the auxiliary be, to signal the progressive or imperfective, and the be triggers an ing marking on the verb. So we get this imperfective form. Now, if we have aspect here and then we have tense up there, then the structure comes out pretty straightforwardly. Okay, so we have the syntax. Now we need the semantics. If aspect is combining with the verb phrase, then we need to take that verb phrase. Right? The verb phrase denotes a set of events, and we'll need to link it with our sense of time and of tense. And if tense is about times, then what we need is a set of times. Right? And so we'll need to add times to our ontology. We can do that using a new type I. And the I stands for interval, not to mention T was already taken. And we add type I to our ontology, and that's going to be the set of temporal intervals. And these intervals are ordered with respect to one another, based on which one comes first or whether they're at the same time, etc. Okay, so we have these temporal intervals, and temporal properties denote properties of these intervals. And we've seen that in class a little bit. So a word like today would be, this set of times between midnight and midnight, and that sort of thing. Okay, so if we have these times, now how do we get our events to link to the times? Right? Well, we need to convert that somehow. If we look at aspect tells us the relationship between the event time and the topic time. But what is the event time, right? It's the time that the event takes place, the runtime of the event. But semantically, we need that time to actually do that. So we'll create a function here, time, and this function will take an E and give you the runtime of E. That is to say, the amount of time that E holds. So this is of type ET. I'm sorry, not ET. It's of type EI. You give it an event, it gives you a time. Right? And so we end up with time of E. And we can just write it like this, the time of E. And that works out pretty well. And so what does aspect do? Well, it says that that the event time is within the topic time. So we would say something like this. Now, we don't know what the topic time is, right? That's going to vary from one context to the other. So we'll make it a property. And now, of course, remember that we need to existentially quantify this event. The event time. It's not just any event, it's existentially quantified over for reasons that we've seen. But now instead of using existential closure, we can write this into the meaning of aspect. So now we can say aspect quantifies over the event and relates its time to the topic time. So now it's acting as a kind of bridge between the event and its arguments and the temporal semantics. And what is it saying? Well, if it's perfective, it says that the event time is within the topic time. And we can extrapolate out, right? So this isn't quite complete because we don't have the VP in it anymore. We have to write that in. And so we'll have to add an argument. So we'll have to make it a little bit bigger. And we say lambda f in d sub st. Right? So the VP, this is going to be this property of events. And then lambda t in d sub I, such that there is an event such that f of E equals 1 and the time of E is a subinterval of t. And that works out for a meaning of perfective aspect. Now, what's nice about the Klein approach to aspect is that if we want the imperfective, all we have to change is this. And then we get the imperfective. And it works out pretty beautifully. Now, if we're looking at tense now, what does tense mean? Right, so we're going to add this time. Right? And early accounts of tense had a quantifier over tense. So when you said Alyssa fell, there was a time where it was true that Alyssa fell. And this introduces the notion that propositions are true or false about particular times or at particular times, which is a very important issue that we're going to set aside. What we're going to focus on is this notion of existential quantification. Now, with subsequent developments, like people like Barbara Partee, found that tense actually behaves more like a pronoun than like a quantifier. And she noticed that if you negate tense, then you get problems. So her classic example is, I didn't turn off the stove. Now, if tense is an existential quantifier, then what that would mean is there is no time in the past where I turned off the stove. Right? And that's not true if you've ever turned off the stove once in your life. Now, another thing that might mean is that there is a time where you didn't turn off the stove. But that's almost trivial, right? That's not the point. And her context was one where you're driving somewhere and then you remembered you forgot to turn off the stove. And in that case, you're not really saying, hey, there's a time in the past where I didn't turn it off. You're talking about a very specific moment. Now, another piece of evidence involves the fact that they're often anaphoric. So if you say, Sheila got drunk at a party, Sheila hosted a party last week and Sam got drunk. When did Sam get drunk? What is the time of Sam getting drunk? Well, it's Sheila's party, right? So there's a bit of an aphora there. And then you can also get tenses covarying, the way that we saw pronouns covarying. So you can say, whenever you eat Chinese food, you're always hungry an hour later. And in that case, you get a quantification over times. It's like every time that you eat Chinese food, you're hungry an hour later after that time. So there's a covariation. And this covariation fact and the anaphora fact combined led Partee to suggest that, well, maybe tenses are pronouns too. She didn't develop a theory of that, and that came later with other linguists like Rena Heim and Angelika Katzer and a number of other people. And what they built this structure, they built this notion of aspect, and they built this notion of tense as being a pronoun and how it would work. So if tense is a pronoun, well, how do we interpret our T head? Let's say it's got past tense. Well, we have aspect, which is a property of times. It's going to be of type IT. And what tense is going to do then is provide the I and give a sentence of type T. Right? We can work that out from the times themselves, or from the types. So we have IT. Well, if this is I and it's a pronoun, then how do we interpret it? Well, we use the pronoun rule. So we can give it an index, let's say 2. And now, what is the meaning of T sub 2? Well, given an assignment A, it's going to be A of 2. But what about past tense? Well, we saw with pronouns that features on pronouns provide presuppositional information. And for Heim, this is exactly what features do with tense. It's the same process. So past tense, you can write it like this. Past tense of 2 is going to be A of 2, but only if A of 2 is in the past. And if recall what Klein's notion of past was, it's that this time precedes the topic, precedes the utterance time. And let's write the utterance time with T sub U, which is a bit of a hedge, because we haven't really defined how that works, but let's just say that it does. We get A of 2 only if it's in the past. So now this time interval is in the past, then we plug it in, and we get the result. So if we say Alyssa fell, then what we end up with is there is an event of Alyssa falling whose time there is an event of Alyssa falling whose time is within T sub 2, within the topic time. And it only makes sense if the topic time is in the past. It's presuppositional. And this notion of presupposition in anaphora for temporal pronouns suggests something very interesting about the nature of tense even more broadly. Think of tense as something crucial to natural language, but it shows that, it's presuppositional. And so it's a slightly different kind of way of looking at tense from what we've been seeing before. But that works out pretty well. And if you look at future and present, then all you have to do is change this relationship. So we get overlaps or succeeds. And that's that. That's how you build the rest of the sentence. So we have aspect, which takes the VP, quantifies over the event, relates that event temporally to the topic time, and tense, which gives you the topic time, and along with a presupposition about whether it's related to the utterance time by coming before, during, or after. And that will work out for many of the cases we've seen, right? We've seen, the Klein reading discusses a number of cases where that picture doesn't quite work, but this is the basic picture, and it works for a large number of cases, and we'll get anyone started in formalizing notions of tense and aspect and incorporating them into the semantics.